Welcome back. It is 7:18. Say hello again to Dr. Alan Kuperman here from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. We've been having these chats about the Middle East and, more importantly, Afghanistan. We're here to talk about that again this morning. So we'll pick his brain and get everything he knows in 4 minutes on Afghani-U.S. relations.
All right. Fasten your safety belt.
Are they at a low point, or is that possible? Have they always been at a low point?
Well, there's been two very bad events in the last month or so. There was the burning of the Korans by American forces, and then there was this horrible massacre of 16 Afghan civilians. And both of those have really undermined the trust between the U.S. and Afghanistan. And the problem is that trust is essential to our military strategy going forward.
How strong was the trust to begin with?
Well, it wasn't...
Prior to these two events?
It wasn't great, and over time it's deteriorated. We've been in that country since 2001. That's 11 years almost. And people don't like to be what they consider to be occupied.
Right.
And so there are things like night raids, which are very effective militarily. We go in the middle of the night. We know where the bad guys are. We come in and we raid the house, and we usually get the bad guys and don't kill any innocents. But the Afghans hate this. They absolutely hate this. And so trust has been deteriorating, but trust is essential because the plan going forward, the American military strategy, is that we transition from American forces to Afghan security forces. And to do that, we have to train them. And to do that, we have to embed with them. And the problem is, if you can't embed American forces with Afghan forces, if the Afghan forces come up and put a bullet in the back of your head.
Which has just happened, this latest incident. One of them killed 2 UN troops.
U.S. troops, yeah.
Is it a safe assumption to say, in 2014, while the troops are supposed to be out, will the Afghan security forces be able to prevent the Taliban from taking over again? Or is that too far in the future?
No, it's the $64,000 question. First of all, it's important to know that not all U.S. forces will probably be out by the end of 2014. That's when the end of combat operations, but there's negotiations going on right now, and in fact there's a NATO summit in May in Chicago, and the idea is that at that point we'll have a plan for at least an agreement for a follow-on force. And that's what we're negotiating right now with the Afghans. So that after 2014, they're talking about 5,000 or 30,000, somewhere in there, troops that can continue to help train, but also help do these targeted strikes. If we find out that there's some al-Qaeda or something like that embedded somewhere in Afghanistan, we want to be able to take them out with a raid, with a drone, with something like that.
Right.
So, but your question is really the important question, which is when most of the U.S. forces pull out, can the Afghan forces hold off the Taliban? And I think most analysts would say no. If you mean prevent the Taliban from dominating certain parts of the country. And I think what you'll get is what you've had before in Afghanistan. In fact, what you had before we did this invasion, which is that certain parts of the country will be controlled by the Taliban, certain parts of the country will be controlled by Karzai and his forces, and certain parts of the country will be controlled by other ethnic groups.
Right.
And it's not ideal, but from the U.S. national security perspective, the question is there anything like al-Qaeda? Is there anything like September 11th? And if the answer is no, if there's not any enemies of ours, then that's good enough.
Right. Is Karzai up to the task?
He's a very interesting character. He's sort of a consensus builder kind of guy. He's not a very hard guy, but he's somehow managed to stay in power.
Yeah.
For all this time. I don't think he's up to the task of, quote-unquote, defeating the Taliban. What they're trying to do is actually make a peace agreement with the Taliban. But he so far doesn't seem to be really up to the task on that either. The U.S. has approached the Taliban, and he sort of vetoed these negotiations. But, if I were the Taliban, would I really be making a deal? No, I'd want victory.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's real tough. It reminds me of Vietnam.
Right.
It reminds me of Vietnam, where we pulled out U.S. forces, we trained up the South Vietnamese forces, and then 2 years later the North Vietnamese came in and took over the whole place.
Right.
And so that's a possible scenario.
So the end game, at least the way you see it, is kind of these regional controls, and that's pretty much the best we can hope for.
It's the least bad of the options.
The least bad of the options. And I asked you this before about invading empires, and you had an interesting slogan to characterize that.
Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires, whether it's the Indians, whether it's the British, whether it's the Soviets, and now maybe this U.S. invasion. Everyone who tries to get control of that area fails. And it's partially because the terrain is very tough. It's partially because the national character is so tough. It's partially because you have these ethnic animosities in the place. And then there's Islam.
Right.
And anyone who comes in there is seen as an infidel. And you know what's very interesting? You saw that when the Quran was burned, there was a bigger backlash than when the 16 people were killed.
Agreed.
You know, it's they really have this embrace of religion, and they see anybody who comes in there as an infidel trying to oppose Islam.
Gotcha. Dr. Alan Kuperman, LBJ School of Public Affairs. Thanks for the visit. As always, we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You bet.